Okay, pop up, Papa, see.
Mommy!
Pop up, see my nose hair. Are you ready?
Yeah, go. Yeah, go.
Set.
Go. Yeah. What?
So Cece decided to, she does not need assistance to get on these couches, because this is what her new project is she brought her couch to our big couch and is sliding down it. It's a lovely day in the life of Cece. Mommy's got her black label on. Mama's not playing. Cece, Bella, honey, stop pushing your sister right now, or you're going to bed.
Hey!
Bella, I'll get it from her. Stop, I'll get it from her. She's off.
Survey 319 oil site remains one of the most clinically harrowing chapters in modern forensic history. When investigators arrived at the remote location on August 16, 2018, the scene was defined by a grim juxtaposition of industrial infrastructure and unimaginable human tragedy. While Shannon Watts had been located in a shallow grave nearby, the recovery of the two children required a specialized, high-risk forensic approach due to their placement inside two separate 20-foot-tall crude oil batteries. This environment presented immediate challenges for the recovery team, as the tanks were roughly 2/3 full of crude oil. From a forensic standpoint, the petroleum served as a complex medium. It acted as a preservative by shielding the bodies from typical aerobic decomposition and insect activity, yet it simultaneously acted as a contaminant that complicated the collection of external DNA and biological markers. The extraction process was a meticulous, multi-hour operation dictated by the physical constraints of the oil tanks. One of the most critical forensic measurements recorded at the scene was the diameter of the thief hatches atop the tanks, which measured a mere 8 inches. This specific detail would later serve as a vital piece of evidence in the prosecution's timeline, proving the narrow constraints the perpetrator worked within to dispose of the victims. As the crude oil was slowly drained through mesh filters to ensure no trace evidence was lost, the bodies of the two girls were eventually reached. Forensic technicians noted significant skin slippage and degloving upon recovery, a common reaction when soft tissue is immersed in petroleum hydrocarbons for an extended period. Despite the chemical impact on the skin, the internal organs remained remarkably intact, which would later prove essential for the toxicology reports. Preliminary observations at the site noted the absence of any obvious ligatures or external weapons, immediately shifting the forensic focus toward asphyxiation. The fact that the victims were placed in separate tanks was recorded as a deliberate act of clinical separation by the offender. The recovery at Survey 319 provided the first silent witnesses to the final moments of Bella and Celeste. The oil-soaked clothing and the state of the hatches were meticulously logged, forming the foundation of a forensic trail that would eventually dismantle Chris Watts' initial fabrications and confirm the grim reality of a premeditated triple homicide. The external examination of 4-year-old Bella Watts at the Weld County Coroner's Office provided the first definitive physical evidence of the violent struggle that occurred prior to her death. Unlike her younger sister, Bella's forensic profile told a story of active resistance. When her body was first examined after being cleansed of the crude oil from the Survey 319 tank, the pathologist noted several key injuries that were distinct from the effects of post-mortem immersion. Most notably, the examination revealed a laceration to the frenulum, the small fold of tissue that connects the upper lip to the gum. This specific injury is a classic forensic marker of blunt force trauma or a hand being pressed violently over the mouth and nose. It indicated that, unlike the other victims, Bella was likely awake and aware during the assault, fighting for air as her airway was forcibly obstructed. Further inspection of Bella's mouth revealed that her teeth had caused additional trauma to the inner lining of her lips, a common occurrence when a victim is smothered and attempts to pull away from their attacker. These injuries were fresh at the time of death, showing no signs of healing, which placed them squarely within the window of the fatal encounter. The forensic team also documented bruising and abrasions on her scalp and skin. While the crude oil had caused significant degloving, where the outer layers of skin begin to slough off, the underlying tissue still held the hemorrhage patterns of the struggle. This physical evidence was crucial because it directly contradicted the initial version of events provided by Chris Watts, where he claimed his daughters were killed spontaneously. The presence of defensive-style injuries suggested a more prolonged and terrifying confrontation. Beyond the trauma to the face and mouth, the external exam focused on the condition of her extremities. There were no ligature marks on the neck, which ruled out the use of a rope or cord, narrowing the cause of death down to manual smothering. The pathologist also noted that Bella's hair had been heavily saturated with oil, and some of it had been pulled or lost during the transit through the narrow 8-inch hatch of the oil tank. The physical dimensions of her body were compared against the diameter of that hatch, providing a chilling mathematical confirmation of the force required to discard her. Every abrasion and contusion was mapped out on a body diagram, creating a permanent record of the final minutes of her life. The external examination of Bella Watts served as a bridge between the recovery site and the internal autopsy. It shifted the narrative from a mysterious disappearance to a clear-cut case of homicidal violence. The injuries found on her face were not just medical findings, they were forensic proof of her final moments of life. These marks told the story of a child who did not go quietly, providing the prosecution with the evidence needed to establish the sheer brutality of the act. By the end of this phase of the examination, it was clear that Bella's death was the result of a determined, manual effort to end her life, setting a somber tone for the internal investigation that would follow. The examination of 3-year-old Celeste Watts provided a forensic contrast to her older sister, yet the findings were no less haunting. While Bella's body bore the clear marks of a desperate struggle, the external and internal examination of Celeste, often referred to by her family as CC, suggested a much swifter, though equally violent, conclusion. When her body was recovered from the second crude oil tank at the Survey 319 site, the primary forensic challenge was the extent of the skin slippage caused by the chemical composition of the oil. Because Celeste was younger and smaller, the petroleum had an even more rapid effect on her delicate soft tissues. Despite this, the medical examiner was able to meticulously document the state of her remains, looking specifically for the telltale signs of manual interference with her breathing. Unlike Bella, Celeste did not have the same level of blunt force trauma to her mouth or a torn frenulum. This led forensic pathologists to conclude that her death likely involved less physical resistance, potentially because she was caught off guard or was physically overwhelmed more quickly due to her size. However, the absence of defensive wounds did not imply a natural death. The autopsy confirmed that the cause of death was formal asphyxiation due to manual smothering. The lack of ligature marks around her neck ruled out strangulation by a rope or cord, narrowing the mechanism of death to the forceful obstruction of her nose and mouth. The pressure required to achieve this in a healthy 3-year-old is significant, and the forensic evidence pointed toward a sustained hold that lasted several minutes until the heart finally stopped. During the internal examination, the pathologist noted that Celeste's lungs showed signs of acute congestion and edema. This is a common finding in smothering cases, where the body's frantic attempt to draw oxygen causes fluid to build up in the lung tissue. Her internal organs, while affected by the external crude oil, remained intact enough to provide a clear picture of her overall health prior to the incident. There were no signs of chronic illness or prior abuse, confirming that Celeste was a thriving child until the moment of her murder. The toxicology report later confirmed that there were no sedative drugs or poisons in her system. She was fully conscious and alert when the assault began, a fact that added a layer of psychological cruelty to the forensic timeline. The technical data gathered from Celeste's autopsy was cross-referenced with the dimensions of the oil tank hatch. At only 8 inches in diameter, the hatch was a tight fit even for a child of her size. Forensics noted specific abrasions on her torso that were consistent with being pushed through the narrow metal opening post-mortem. This detail was vital for the prosecution, as it illustrated the callous nature of the disposal. The forensic picture for both sisters was complete. They had both been smothered to death by a person they trusted, their bodies used as evidence of a calculated attempt to hide a crime that the oil could not wash away. The internal examination and toxicology reports for Bella and Celeste Watts represented the most clinical and definitive phase of the forensic investigation. While the external injuries told a story of struggle, the internal data provided the scientific proof of how their bodies responded to the final moments of life. Because both girls had been submerged in crude oil for several days, the first task for the medical examiners was to determine if any of the petroleum had entered their respiratory or digestive systems. The absence of crude oil in the lungs or stomach was a critical forensic find. It proved beyond any scientific doubt that both Bella and Celeste were already deceased before they were dropped into the oil tanks. Had they been breathing when they entered the oil, the viscous fluid would have been aspirated deep into the bronchial tubes, a marker that was entirely absent in both autopsies. Toxicology screenings were conducted to rule out the possibility that the children had been sedated or poisoned prior to the murders. In many cases of filicide, a perpetrator will use medication to incapacitate the victims, but the results for the Watts sisters were negative for all common drugs, including antihistamines, sleep aids, and narcotics.
To make anything out. Of course, in the one tank the oil was not as deep, and so your chance of making something out in that tank was better. So when this photo was taken by crime scene analyst Dave Yoakum, as I say, using his cell phone, he was trying to see inside the tanks. They knew the children had been dumped in the tanks, and yet when he shone a special torch inside the tank, the view was obstructed by venting mist. And that's quite important to bear in mind, is that prior to them opening the hatch and prior to them sort of accessing the scene at close quarters, I think it was Watch's supervisor Luke Eppel that actually vented the tanks. And by venting, what we mean is it's sort of a pressure release. And the whole idea is that by doing that, when you're approaching the tanks, you're not going to have the possibility of an explosion. You're not going to have built up gases in a sort of explosive situation. So by venting, you are mitigating that possibility. In line with this, there are also people who say that Chris Watts wanted to create an explosion at the well site and whatnot. Well, he vented at the well site. He activated a pressure release valve specifically to prevent an explosion. So people need to understand how these systems and how the whole infrastructure works.
This confirmed a chilling reality. Both children were fully conscious and in a natural state of awareness during the physiological stress of the assault. The internal examination of the lungs revealed petechial hemorrhages, tiny, pin-sized spots of bleeding caused by the rupture of capillaries. These are classic hallmarks of asphyxiation, occurring when the pressure in the chest and head rises sharply as the victim struggles to breathe against an obstructed airway. In Bella's case, these markers were particularly pronounced, consistent with the higher level of physical resistance noted in her external exam. The condition of the internal organs also allowed the forensic team to estimate the time of death relative to their mother. While the oil had a preservative effect on the organs, the level of tissue degradation was consistent with the timeline provided by the investigation into the home security system and Chris Watts' movements. The hearts of both girls were found to be structurally normal, with no underlying conditions that could have contributed to a sudden death. This ruled out any defense claims of accidental death or sudden medical emergencies. The liver and kidneys were also analyzed for metabolic markers of stress, which further supported the conclusion of a violent, oxygen-depriving event. By synthesizing the internal findings with the lack of environmental contaminants in the lungs, the forensic team solidified the cause of death as manual smothering. This chapter of the forensic report closed the door on any ambiguity regarding the how and when. The science proved that the girls did not die from the oil, nor did they die from a gentle or accidental process. They were healthy children whose lives were ended by the deliberate, forceful deprivation of oxygen. The internal data remained the most objective evidence in the case, stripping away the emotional weight of the tragedy to reveal the cold, hard biological facts of the crime. The forensic timeline of the Watts case was constructed by marrying the biological data from the autopsies with an extensive digital footprint. While the medical examiner provided the how of the deaths, the when was refined through a granular analysis of the family's smart home technology and GPS data. Forensic experts focused heavily on the Vivint Home security system, which logged every movement within the house on the morning of August 13, 2018. The system recorded that the front door opened at 1:48 a.m. when Shannon returned from a business trip. But after that, the house remained electronically sealed until 5:27 a.m. This 5-hour window became the primary focus of the forensic reconstruction, as it provided the only opportunity for the murders to have occurred without an external intruder. Digital forensics on Chris Watts' work truck provided the most damning spatial evidence. His vehicle was equipped with a GPS tracking system that recorded his exact coordinates and speed in real time. On the morning of the murders, the GPS showed his truck idling in the driveway for nearly an hour before departing at 5:27 a.m. This matched the security footage from a neighbor's driveway camera, which captured Watts backing his truck into the garage, an unusual behavior for him. The forensic synchronization of the truck's departure with the estimated time of death for the girls created a narrow window. By analyzing the distance from the home to the Survey 319 site and the truck's arrival at 6:53 a.m., investigators were able to prove that the bodies were transported during this transit, rather than being disposed of at a later time. Phone forensics added another layer to the timeline. Data extracted from the girls' iPads and the family's cell phones showed a sudden and permanent cessation of activity. For children who were frequent users of digital entertainment, the lack of any interaction with their devices after the late evening of August 12 was a significant forensic indicator of their disappearance or incapacitation. Furthermore, the recovery of deleted text messages and search histories on Chris Watts' phone revealed a calculated shift in his behavior leading up to that morning. The forensic team noted that while the physical evidence in the house had been meticulously cleaned, leaving no blood or signs of a struggle, the digital trail was impossible to erase. By coordinating the GPS pings with the physiological state of the bodies, the forensic team established that Bella and Celeste were killed in the early morning hours, likely just before or during the loading of the truck. This evidence dismantled the defense's attempt to claim a longer period of time between the events. The digital timeline acted as a rigid framework, holding the physical evidence in place and ensuring that the sequence of the crime was indisputable. This synergy between the digital ghost of the house and the biological reality of the victims turned a circumstantial case into a forensic certainty. The forensic examination of the Watts family home at 2825 Saratoga Trail revealed a scene that was unnervingly clean. When investigators first entered the residence, they were met not with the chaotic disarray typical of a violent struggle, but with an environment that appeared meticulously curated. Forensic technicians utilized high-intensity light sources and chemical reagents like luminol to search for latent bloodstains, yet the results were largely negative throughout the primary living areas and the children's bedrooms. This absence of biological fluid was a significant forensic finding in itself. It suggested that the method of killing, manual smothering, was specifically chosen or resulted in a clean crime scene that did not trigger the traditional markers of a physical assault. The lack of blood spatter or forced entry pointed directly toward an indoor event involving a known subject who had the time and inclination to sanitize the environment. Despite the visual cleanliness, forensic vacuuming and trace evidence collection were performed on the girls' beds and the master bedroom. Investigators focused on the bedding, looking for void patterns or signs of struggle that might have left microscopic fibers or skin cells behind. In the girls' rooms, the beds were found made, which struck investigators as inconsistent with a frantic morning departure. Forensic analysis of the trash bins and the laundry room revealed that certain linens had been stripped and washed recently. This led to the conclusion that any immediate physical evidence of the struggle, such as saliva or sweat from the victims, had likely been neutralized through the use of household detergents. The forensic team noted that the house did not smell of decomposition or chemicals, but rather of a standard, lived-in home, suggesting the perpetrator had managed the transition from a crime scene back to a residence with calculated efficiency. The search for DNA evidence extended to Chris Watt's work truck, a 2011 Ford F-150. While the home was scrubbed, the truck became a mobile forensic repository. Technicians recovered hair and skin cell samples from the backseat area that were consistent with the children having been placed there. However, because the children frequently rode in the vehicle, the mere presence of their DNA was not incriminating. The forensic value lay in the touch DNA and the positioning of certain items, such as a shovel and a rake found in the truck bed, which contained soil samples. When analyzed, these soil samples provided a mineralogical match to the earth at the Survey 319 site, rather than the soil found at the Saratoga Trail home. This microscopic link was a critical forensic bridge, tying the vehicle and the suspect directly to the disposal site. Ultimately, Chapter 6 of the forensic narrative highlights the silent nature of the crime. The absence of a bloody scene forced investigators to rely on the more subtle science of trace materials and the psychological profile of a sanitized environment. The perpetrator had successfully cleared the macro evidence of the struggle within the home, but he could not account for the microscopic transfer of soil and the digital logs of his movements. The forensic team's ability to find nothing, where there should have been something, such as unmade beds or morning clutter, became a powerful indicator of premeditation and a post-mortem cleanup. The specialized forensic analysis of the crude oil tanks at Survey 319 provided the final physical proof of the mechanical force and cold calculation involved in the disposal of Bella and Celeste. To understand the physics of the crime, investigators had to reconcile the height of the tanks, 20 feet tall, with the narrowness of the 8-inch thief hatches, located at the top. This required a detailed reconstruction of how the bodies were maneuvered. Forensics determined that for a child of Bella's size to pass through such a restricted opening, a specific amount of downward pressure had to be applied. The presence of linear abrasions on her shoulders and torso, which were documented during the autopsy, aligned perfectly with the internal rim of the metal hatch. These marks were post-mortem, meaning they occurred after her heart had stopped, and they served as a mechanical record of her body being forced into the darkness of the tank. The crude oil itself played a dual role in the forensic narrative. As a nonpolar solvent, the petroleum hydrocarbons began a process of chemical degradation on the girl's clothing and skin almost immediately. However, because the tanks were sealed and the oil was thick, it created an anaerobic environment that slowed down certain types of bacterial decomposition. This preservation allowed the medical examiner to identify the lack of oil in the girls' lungs, proving they were not alive when they hit the surface of the fluid. Furthermore, the splash patterns and the positioning of the remains at the very bottom of the tanks suggested a vertical drop. Given the density of crude oil compared to human tissue, the bodies eventually sank to the base of the 20-foot structures, where they remained submerged under thousands of pounds of liquid pressure until the tanks were drained. Forensic engineers also examined the hatch handles and the surrounding catwalk for touch DNA and fiber evidence. Despite the presence of oil, which can degrade biological samples, investigators recovered microscopic fibers from the girls' nightclothes snagged on the jagged underside of the hatch openings. This trace evidence was a physical bridge, connecting the victims to the specific point of entry. The physics of the disposal also ruled out any possibility of the girls climbing into the tanks themselves. The height of the ladder, the weight of the spring-loaded hatches, and the precision required to fit through the 8-inch gap made it a physical impossibility for a 3-year-old or 4-year-old. This data point was a crucial forensic tool used to dismantle any suggestion that the children's deaths were a tragic accident or a result of their own actions. By the end of this technical phase, the oil tanks were no longer just a hiding place. They were a forensic repository of the perpetrator's movements. The measurements of the hatches, the chemistry of the oil, and the mechanical abrasions on the victims' bodies combined to tell a story of a disposal method that was as efficient as it was cruel. The technical data gathered from the Survey 319 site provided the how of the concealment, ensuring that every physical constraint of the environment was accounted for in the official record. This chapter of the investigation closed the loop on the physical evidence, leaving no room for alternative theories regarding how the girls ended up in the industrial graveyard. The final forensic conclusions in the deaths of Bella and Celeste Watts served as the definitive refutation of every lie told during the initial stages of the investigation. By synthesizing the external trauma, the internal biological markers, and the environmental data from the Survey 319 site, medical examiners and investigators produced a report that was scientifically unassailable. The most haunting conclusion drawn from the collective evidence was the active nature of the murders. The forensic findings of manual smothering, specifically the trauma to Bella's mouth and the petechial hemorrhaging in both girls, confirmed that these were not deaths of neglect or accidents of fate. They were the result of a sustained, physical application of force. This medical certainty stripped away the possibility of a crime of passion or a sudden, unexplained medical event, framing the acts instead as deliberate and focused homicides. The legal impact of these forensic revelations cannot be overstated. When the autopsy reports were finalized, they provided the prosecution with the leverage necessary to secure a guilty plea without the need for a protracted trial. The physical evidence, the 8-inch diameter of the oil tank hatches, the lack of crude oil in the girls' lungs, and the negative toxicology results created a closed loop of facts. These facts proved that the children were alive and conscious until they were smothered, and that they were deceased before they ever reached the oil site. Faced with the mathematical and biological impossibility of his shifting stories, Chris Watts was forced to confront the reality that the forensic ghost of his daughter's final moments was etched into their very tissues. The science spoke for the victims when they could no longer speak for themselves. Beyond the courtroom, the forensics of the Watts case changed the way investigators approach family man homicides and the disposal of remains in industrial environments. The recovery process at Survey 319 became a case study in hazardous material evidence collection, demonstrating how petroleum can both preserve and complicate a crime scene. The meticulous documentation of the girls' injuries also provided deep insight into the psychology of the perpetrator. The choice of manual smothering over more distant methods of killing suggested a chilling level of proximity and resolve. The final forensic record stands as a testament to the precision of modern pathology, ensuring that even in the most remote and industrial of graves, the truth of a victim's final moments can be retrieved and documented with clinical clarity. Ultimately, the forensic examination of Bella and Celeste Watts did more than just solve a crime. It honored the reality of their lives by accurately recording the tragedy of their deaths. Every abrasion, every chemical reaction in the oil, and every digital ping from the home security system was a piece of a larger puzzle that, when completed, left no room for doubt. The case remains a cornerstone of true crime forensics, not only because of its notoriety, but because of the standard it set for investigative thoroughness. The science of the autopsies provided the final word in a case defined by deception, ensuring that the legacy of the Watts sisters is defined by the truth of what happened to them, rather than the lies told to cover it up.